Hello, one and all, and welcome to an episode of Top Deck Thoughts. Now, a few things before we get started. One, I'm actually wearing a pretty snazzy shirt that Wizard of the Coast sent me. This is actually, since the holidays are coming up, I thought if you want to have actually a snazzy shirt, you can actually buy one down link below. I kind of wanted to advertise this because actually the money being raised for the shirt sales is actually going to go to the Lamp House slash also the Trevor Project. So it helps support a good cause, and you also get a nice, really colorful shirt in the process to show your magic shenanigans. Also, I'm going to be trying my best to. I signed up for it to participate in the Channel Fireball Boxing League. The basic premise is you essentially make a commander deck out of a bots, as well as upgrading the deck with a sit pack package that goes out throughout the week. Now, granted, you can still sign up for this as pretty much, I believe you can still sign up for it as of the recording, though it is one of those you won't be able to participate in the first week, but you still should be able to participate in the second week. So if you want to give it a shot, I'll provide a link down below along with the t-shirt sale as mentioned before. Now, for this episode of Top Deck Bots, since one of the recent sets that just came out is Commander Legends, I thought it would actually be fun to talk about the sleeper cards of the set. Now, specifically, when I mean a sleeper card, I mean a card that I think. Now, let's be frank, there's a lot of really good cards that came out from Commander Legends. It's actually a pretty nice set. But I think there's some cards that people are kind of missing the chance to actually try out in their brews due to the fact that the spotlight are on the more popular cards of the set. The Jewel Lotus, the Opposition Agents, Hull Breacher, etc., etc. You probably have your pet favorite card. Mine's probably Gin, along with one of the sleeper cards we're going to be talking about in a minute. So, nevertheless, this episode is going to pretty much talk about some cards that come from Commander Legends that I think you want to give a shot within your brews. I'm not going to say they're auto-includes because, well, auto-include is kind of a loaded term in a casual format, and even in some instance, the competitive variation of the EDH format, but that's another video for another day. Nevertheless, let's talk about some cards that I think you want to keep an eye on when you are doing your brewing shenanigans. There are a little bit of sleepers in this set. Jelly? Let's share. The first card that's on my top sleeper cards from Commander Legends. This one seems weird since I know a lot of people were hyped up for this card. But personally, this was a sleeper for me personally, which was Artshell's Lagoon Mystic. Now, originally when I looked at this card, I kind of thought it was cool, but I wasn't really that impressed with it because when you look at it first glance, it's like, oh, so this is like Amulet essentially. So a lot of people, including me, were kind of a little bit down on that. Slash, also a lot of people were making the argument of why wasn't this a banned card, yada yada yada, etc. etc. However, I actually pulled this in one of my original kind of like sealed pulls, so I was actually wanting to just toy with it. Essentially, I opened a few packs early, so I was like, okay, let's actually brew this into a commander deck. And I'm going to say this, I actually, surprisingly, this was one of the funnest brews I did in a while, because it's one of those where, you know you're getting to something when you actually have fun brewing the mana base for the deck, which is weird. Now, yes, one of the positives is the fact that it is kind of an amulet titan kind of thing, so it does make you allow to ramp with stuff like Cultivate a lot better, plus also has some really neat tricks with Myriad Landscape where the lands will enter and untap, stuff like that, and of course the bounce land trick that everybody mentions with stuff like Walking Atlas and the one landfall blue enchantment from the Battle for Zendikar that I'm having a brain fart in the name. Someone will probably tell me in the comments. There's stuff like that, but one thing that actually makes Artshell is kind of a really cool card when you actually play with it a little bit. It's actually a really nice card. How do I phrase this? It's actually a really nice commander to actually play with people with a variety of deck power levels, if that makes sense. Like, if a lot of people are playing kind of like budget level, kind of like casual commander, this is actually really nice because it allows them to play their tap lands on tap. It allows kind of like a more group hugging method without being too mean. And the fact that since this is actually, if you design this right, you can just tap it at the right time. You can pretty much tap it in a scenario where you feel like it's necessary to help a opponent to essentially not get too far in advance and actually make the game very problematic. Now, yes, you can technically go with the extremes with this. You could probably go extreme stacks, or you can go extreme group hug. But honestly, I think this is one of those cards where it's actually nice to actually do it in a balance. Do some group huggy elements, have some fun. Like the one brew that I had fun with is kind of like a group huggy slash also aristocratic token based deck design with a teeny tiny Super Friends package in there. And honestly, I just been having a blast with this card. So, I was sleeping on it. I didn't thought too much of it until I played with it. I'm like, okay, this card actually is pretty cool. Oh yes, and I would forget to mention, yes, the fact that now tap zombies enter it untapped is very nice. So take your zombie Armageddon spells and make 13 untapped zombies. Oh no, that's not the name of it. It's not Zombie Armageddon. What was the name of that? Someone's going to tell me in the comments. Nonetheless, on to the next sleeper. Next one. This one, probably the Jess guy on Twitter is probably going to have fun to hear my 2 cents on this one. Nostro, Voice of the Crags. 1 blue, red, and white legendary creature Chimera. Okay, well, let's just get this down and out of the way. There was a whole cycle of the pretty much cons color pair, essentially, of legendary creatures. Personally, my favorite is Gin, which is the Mardu variation. Probably secondary favorite would be Artshell's. But everybody, when they saw the Jeskai one, they kind of were a little bit disappointed. And the main reason why is because with all the other ones, they do kind of like have a fun little gimmick of sorts that actually seems like to be a very fun thing to brew around. Well, Nostril at first glance doesn't really feel like that. It's like, oh, you can just tap it and just get X to be a really big number if you cast a lot of spells. Woo! And I think also one other thing that made the Jeskai players kind of like disappointed with this card is because it is kind of one of those at first glance it does look like a boring card. And remember, we had some really good Jeskai legendaries in the past. We had Narset, we have even just I'm forgetting the name of the Zerdu, not Zerdu. It's the one that essentially you can give your creatures to your friends and such, or permanents that you control to your owners and such, and you draw cards from that. Yet again, someone's going to tell me in the comments. I'm kind of having a brain fart tonight. Nevertheless, even that one has a lot more fun dynamics, so at first glance, this card does not look great. So why am I saying this is a sleeper? Well, the thing is, this is actually kind of a really good card as your commander in a very, very specific deck. And the deck is obviously Storm. And when we're talking about Storm, we are talking about, of course, the Dramatic Reversal Isochron Scepter combo. This is a really, really good card in that deck design, because, simply put, you can, as long as you have a good draw spells and all that stuff, and even just essentially ways to just cast spells and constantly untap artifacts and such, you can generate a lot of mana really quick, which then allows you to cast more spells, which then allows you to untap this and then just do its effects. Now, many people are going to point, well, sure, you can do that, but the effects are not really that great, are they? Well, you kind of did have to brew around a little bit more. Like, let's take a look at all these abilities. First off, Scryets. There's actually some legendaries that are in the set that actually can help us make that into draw spells. Specifically, the Sphinx that allows us that anytime we scry, we draw cards. That's going to be a pretty good inclusion in here to take advantage of that. And even scrying is not that bad, all things considered. There's also just dealing damage to target creature. That can just be used as a way to help essentially do a one-sided board wipe. And if you want to do it to make it deal damage to your opponent and such, all is simple. You just need a Stuffy Doll or a Brash Taunter, and that can just be a pretty quick way to essentially deal lethal damage to your opponents. And even gaining Ed's life, yes, that's probably the less exciting part. You can make your joke of how white always has the factor that they gain life, yada yada yada. Yes, I know that joke, yada yada yada. But still, remember, we have stuff like Aetherfruit's Reservoir in the format, where gaining a lot of life is not that bad when we can use it as a laser cannon. Plus, there's just also other really janky shenanigans you can do with this card. It's one of those cards where I think the best way to phrase it is, it's a good card, but the problem is it's a boring good card, I think it's the best way to phrase it, which, yet again, I think that's kind of what led to the disappointment of the card. Nevertheless, there are some shenanigans you can do with this if you have the solid shell for it, and I still think that people are going to try to jank brew around this card, so keep your eye on it. I think the card is actually a lot better than taken at first glance. Seriously. Next up, speaking of kind of like talking about how white was kind of looked at with a little bit of a disappointing glance in this set, there's this spell that, yet again, I am still surprised that people downrated this card. Triumphant Reckoning. Sits in free white. Yes, 9 mana is a lot, don't get me wrong. And the sorcery spell that has returned all artifact, enchantment, and planeswalker cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now, the common argument that I hear why this spell is not that great is, well, for spending 9 mana, you don't actually reanimate creatures with this spell, and it would have been a lot better if you were able to reanimate your creatures. Okay, well, let me get to the argument of why that actually is not really the best argument in the world, and why this spell is actually ridiculously absurd. First thing, technically, for people who play this type of effects in kind of like Commander and such, the returning all artifacts or enchantment spells from your graveyard to the library, they usually play around it to make sure that they can still return creatures with those spells. You know how? They use it by playing artifact creatures and enchantment creatures. Let's just be frank, we have a really ton, like a ton of really good enchantment and artifact creatures. We have Nightblade Ancient, we have essentially the Archons, we have even the gods from all the previous sets, and maybe even the upcoming sets, if they are still enchantments, from the Kaldheim set, potentially. So, and of course, there's just the good artifact creatures, such as like Wormcoil, Engine. I mean, I could go on. Like, you know the list of really good commander cards that are both artifact creatures or enchantment creatures. Like, I could list them off. And if you can tailor your brew around that, you can actually make this as the quote-unquote creature reanimation spell that many people have essentially said that this isn't. However, there's also the one aspect that this can also return planeswalker cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, which is also another way to build board presence, since we are getting a lot of good, powerful planeswalkers that do build board presence. Like the recent one that's in standard at the moment would be Vivian Monster's Advocate. We also have the new like Ashiok if you go into an Esper route. So just being able to get a major, just returning all your stuff from the battlefield, can help you build your board presence without a sweat. And knowing how planeswalkers usually are the ones where it's like you can play it once and it gets targeted and then just goes to the graveyard, just having this as a way to just reanimate planeswalkers that die early so you can go back and get a major board advantage is nothing to underestimate. Plus, there's also the cute shenanigans you could do with, like, oh, if I remember correctly, if there are ways to essentially, I don't know, make your graveyard cards in your graveyard all artifacts essentially by a certain little artifact that someone's going to mention in the comments, you know what I'm talking about. That's also another way to look at this card. So, yeah. Don't get me wrong, the white mythics were not totally amazing, even though I still like a majority of them, with maybe the exception of the artifact, even though I think the artifact could still be used in like a carry style artifact equipment or the travel decks, personally. But honestly, I'm still surprised that many people are downplaying Triumphant Reckoning. This card is, in the right deck, is ridiculously absurd. Don't sleep on it. It's really good. And of course, if you're playing Sharoom or any like artifact or heavy enchantment, or heavy artifact based decks, or Super Friends decks, you should probably play this card. I'm not going to say it's an auto-include, but it's a nice inclusion in your deck, let's just say. Also, another really good card that I think people are going to be sleeping on until later, Nadir's Nightblade. I've been actually seeing a lot of people have not even realized this card, but 2 in a black, 1/3, Elf Warrior, uncommon. Whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This card is absurd, and here's the reason why. Now, this is kind of like a Blood Artist, but it's only specific to tokens you control, which sounds a little unexciting at first, until you realize how in this format with specific decks, how many tokens that can be generated. I mean, we're talking about stuff like, let's say you're playing this in an Orzhov deck, you're probably playing Smothering type and generating a lot of treasure tokens. So having all your treasure tokens be able to be like, oh, every time I use mana, I am going to drain my opponents. And if there's like a way you could do like maybe in an Esper design where you do a wheel fetch so you can get like a ton of treasures, that could just be used as a lethal spell. That's absurd. And then also all the other token-based deck designs we have, like there's stuff like Entire's Tracker that generates a lot of clues, so being able to have it where every time you activate a clue token, you essentially then drain opponent. That's also really nice. There's just also just all kind of like, yes, the ones that they're hinting at here is of course the black green elf tribal deck with the token synergies. That's of course the ones that they want to hint to you for in draft. But there's just a lot of token strategies that are in the aristocratic variety that are going to, in my honest opinion, adore this card. Especially if you generate a lot of tokens, keep an eye on this. This card is pretty nutty. Plus, also, it's a nice insurance policy for board whites, because keep in mind, it says when they leave the battlefield, not when they die. So even if an opponent like exiles your entire board, you're still going to get the drain effect, which is a definitely nice plus. So you play aristocrats, you have a lot of tokens, or you even just generate a lot of tokens within your deck design, and you have black in your mana pool. Yeah, you really want to try Nadir's Nightblade. It is nutty. Next up, a weird inclusion considering the fact that red had a lot of good spells that are considered sleepers, but this one I kind of wanted to talk about. Flamecan Herald, 2 and a red, elemental wizard. Keep in mind the tribal archetypes do matter, especially if you're playing an elemental wizard tribal. But of course, the effect is commander spells you cast out Cascade, which doesn't seem as exciting at first glance. This is definitely one of the rares where you're like, okay, it's a free 2 elemental wizard. There's some tribal mana synergies. Yeah, giving my commander spells having Cascade is nice, but why are you saying this is a sleeper? Honestly, I think this card is actually legit good when you consider the factor that the commander tax is a thing. So yeah, let's say you cast your commander, let's say it's a 4-drop commander, and then you just cast it, you get the Cascade effect, and you get a free drop. Okay, that's good. But remember, we do have the factor that, let's say your commander gets removed, then the commander tax applies. So the factor is, this is kind of like a weird semi-discount spell for your commander tax in a weird, roundabout way. So like when you have to pay the commander tax next turn and then have to pay 6 mana for your commander, oh hey, it's Cascade 6. And then Cascade 8. Cascade 10. You kind of seeing where I'm going here? So this is actually a really nice card to actually help you kind of generate or at least gain lost mana that you would have to do when you have to cast your commanders later in the game if you have to recast them for higher mana costs. Which I think that's a really underrated ability that this card is going to provide. Plus also, it's an elemental. Elemental tribal decks are going to love this because they usually most elemental decks I know do try to run a semi-cascade sub-strategy, so there you go. And then also wizards do the same thing if they can, so there you go. It's going to be an unincluded in a lot of cascade style decks, but I do think this is a card that if you want to have a fun inclusion in your 99 and you are playing red, give this a shot. I think this card is actually legit a lot better than taken at first glance. Yes, it's a free 2, it dies to anything, but if you design your deck right, they probably will try to deal with more problematic threats that a free 2 is something they're not going to worry about until you get a really nice free spell out of it. So, yeah, I think this card is actually legit really good. Next up, this one is actually not more talking about Commander as more talking about Pauper, which in this case is Finclade Fugitives. 5 and a green for an Elf Elemental Rogue at common, 7/4, can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, and Encore for 4 and a green. Now, in a majority of green Stompy decks, I think they are going to actually be very considerate of this card. Now, yes, it is just stats, and a majority of green Stompy decks do want to have additional power to this, like additional like trample or vigilance or stuff like that. But I do think this is a card to at least consider at the very least, because one, being able to not be blocked by creatures power 2 or less is very nice, and the factor that this can attack into stuff like Gurmag Angler is also really nice, so you can just use this as a stompy variation of a removal spell, which is nice. But I do think the Encore ability is also a really nice touch with this card, because the factor is this can actually be used later down the line in Pauper to just essentially, if your opponent keeps removing, you can use the Encore ability in the graveyard, since your opponent can't respond to it unless they have like a stifle effect, which as far as I'm aware, there's not any in Pauper, so you can just use this, generate a quick token, and do lethal points of damage if you're playing a Stompy based strategy. I think this is going to be the Popper sleeper card of the set. I do think this is actually a lot better than it looks at first glance for Popper. In Commander, you're playing elves or you're playing the rogue tribals with a splash of green, or just playing the salamander deck. Yeah, hey, you can give it a shot. It's more of a really nice budget option, but it is kind of cute to have the Encore ability and attack with a bunch of salamander rogues, so very nice. And my top sleeper card of the set that I think a lot of people are going to be tilting their head sideways when they say this card is a sleeper. Well, mostly in the sense that most people I think are going to be like, wait, this is a good card. Ingenuity Engine. 7 mana for an artifact with Cascade. Oh, and it has an ability of 1 and tap to sacrifice an artifact and return a target artifact you control to its owner's hand. Okay, this one I'm going to have to explain myself because I know a lot of people are going to be like, why do you think this card's good? And kind of like, let me explain. Okay, first of all, this is a 7 mana Cascade spell, which is actually really, really nice. And the factor is that this is an artifact, which then, with a lot of ways that we can make artifacts cheaper within Commander, you can actually cast this pretty consistently without much of a sweat, and if you need to have this at discount and have a lower Cascade, perfectly fine. But the one thing that I think people are going to underestimate is that activated ability. 1 in a tap, sacrifice an artifact, return target artifact control to its owner's hand. If you need to, you could just as simply sacrifice the Ingenuity Engine and then just use it to return a artifact you want to protect, essentially from being like Vandal Blast or something like that. You can do stuff simple as that. And then, of course, you have ways of like refurbish to return this back and such. I do think the activated ability is kind of one of those things where that's what makes this card actually a lot more decent than it takes at first glance. The ability to both sacrifice specific artifacts to be able to protect certain other artifacts, very nice. And even if you need to, later down the line, since we do need mana sinks in Commander, this is actually a pretty decent mana sink. Just tap 1, sacrifice let's say a servo token or a just small artifact token you have. Bounce this to your hand. Oh, hey, you're going to Cascade. And if you have any way, like Leyline of Anticipation or other realms of giving your spells flash, this could be, in some circumstances, like if you're playing this in green with Seedborn Muse, is something just a constant way of being like, hey, I'm going to just sack, return something, Cascade, boop, boop, and repeat it over and over and over again. Now, I think this is going to be a deck that's mostly in the ramp variety of deck designs, don't get me wrong. It's not like an amazing card, but I think this card's actually a lot better than taken at first glance. Don't sleep on it, keep an eye on it. This card actually is legit pretty decent. Plus, also, since we have Reigns of Brightheart in the format, and also stuff like ways to copy the activated ability, something to keep in mind is just what I'm saying. Nevertheless, that is my Sleepers of Commander's Legends. If you have any cards that you think are sleepers that people should keep an eye on, just post them in the comments down below. I hope you all have a lovely night. Or day, wherever you're at. This is LevDev, signing out. Bada beep, bada boop.